You are on HOA spot. I stayed calm and let her talk. I am timing you, Julie shouted, holding her phone 6 inches from my face like she was filming evidence for a war crimes tribunal. My car was still running. I had been home for maybe 90 seconds. Karen shouted that my car was a hazard and that the hazard fee was non-refundable. She jabbed her finger at the windshield where my guest pass sat exactly where it was supposed to be, and told me the pass was expired even though I could see the date printed on it from where I stood. The tow truck was already idling at the curb with its amber lights spinning. I am an EMT dispatcher in Naples, Florida, and I work 12-hour nights, which means I cannot miss calls, and I cannot afford to have my car disappear into a tow yard while I am on shift. Julie Clark is the vice president of the Briarwood Property Owners Association, and she has made it her personal mission to turn every parking space in this neighborhood into a potential violation. She tapped her clipboard in a clear plastic sleeve and said, "This is not parking, it is a violation." I asked her what violation. She said the guest pass was not valid because I had used it on a non-guest vehicle. I told her it was my car. She said that made it worse. She said the pass system was for guests only, and if I was parking my own car under a guest pass, that was fraud. I pointed out that I had a resident decal on my windshield. She leaned in close, squinting, and said the decal was faded and therefore invalid. I could still read the serial number. She said that was irrelevant. The decal had to be pristine or it did not count. She turned and waved at the tow truck driver, who put the truck in reverse and started backing up my driveway. I told her to stop. She said it was too late. The tow authorization had been issued. I asked when. She said this morning. I asked why I had not been notified. She said notification was sent via the HOA portal, and failure to check the portal was not an excuse. I pulled out my phone and opened the portal. There was no notification. She glanced at my screen and said, "You should have read the rules before you moved in, sweetheart." That line hung in the air like gasoline fumes. I did not say anything back. I just looked at her. She smiled. She thought she had won. The wheel lift clanked under my rear axle. I heard the hydraulic whine as it started to lift. Julie held her phone on a gimbal, filming me from inches away, narrating for her audience like she was a law enforcement officer making an arrest. She said, "Subject refused to comply with parking regulations. Vehicle is now being secured for removal. Hazard fee applies." I asked her what hazard. She pointed at my car and said, "That." I asked her to be specific. She said the car was blocking emergency access. I was parked in my own driveway. She said the driveway was too close to the fire lane stripe on the street, and that made my car a hazard by proximity. I looked at the curb. There was no fire lane stripe. She said the stripe had been removed for repaving, but the rules still applied. I walked back to the tow truck. The driver was a guy in his 20s wearing a company shirt with the name of a vendor I had never heard of. I asked him who authorized the tow. He said the HOA. I asked him if he had seen a signed authorization form. He said he had a work order on his tablet. I asked to see it. He hesitated. Julie appeared beside me and said, "You do not have the right to inspect vendor documents." I told her I had the right to see any document that authorized the removal of my property. She said that was not how it worked. She said the HOA had a contract with the tow company, and the contract gave them the authority to remove any vehicle in violation of community standards. I asked her to show me the contract. She said it was proprietary. The hydraulic lift whined louder. My car was now tilted at a 15-degree angle, rear wheels off the ground. I took out my phone and started recording. Julie immediately stepped in front of my lens and said, "You are not allowed to film me without consent." I told her this was a public space. She said it was private property owned by the HOA. I told her I was a homeowner and I had every right to document what was happening on my own driveway. She raised her phone higher and said, "I am documenting your harassment." I asked her how filming her was harassment when she was filming me. She did not answer. She just kept recording. A neighbor walked past holding up a phone with the screen turned away, clearly filming the whole scene. Julie did not acknowledge him. The tow truck driver got out and walked around the car, checking the wheel lift attachment. I asked him again to stop. He said he was just doing his job. I told him I would pay him to unhook the car right now. He said he could not do that without authorization from the HOA. Julie stepped between us and said, "Any attempt to interfere with a lawful tow will result in additional fines." I asked her what the fine was. She said $250 for the tow, $100 for the hazard designation, and $50 for the expired decal, $400 total. I asked her if she was serious. She said the fees were non-negotiable and non-refundable. I asked her when the hearing was. She said there was no hearing. I told her that violated the HOA bylaws. She said emergency enforcement actions did not require hearings. I asked her what the emergency was. She pointed at my car again and said, "That." I told her my car had been parked in my driveway for 6 months without incident. She said the violation had been discovered this morning during a routine compliance sweep. I asked her who did the sweep. She said she did. I asked her why she was doing compliance sweeps at 7 in the morning. She said that was when violations were most visible. I asked her if she had done sweeps on other streets. She said that was confidential. The driver climbed back into the truck and put it in gear. Julie stepped aside and waved him forward like she was directing traffic. I told him I was calling the police. He stopped. Julie said, "Go ahead, call them. They will tell you the same thing." I dialed. The dispatcher asked what the emergency was. I explained that my car was being towed from my own driveway without proper notice. The dispatcher said it sounded like a civil matter and suggested I contact the HOA directly. I told her the HOA was the one doing the towing. She said she would send an officer to document the incident, but that it would take at least 30 minutes. Julie smiled. She said, "You have 20 minutes before the truck leaves." I asked her what happened in 20 minutes. She said the tow yard closed at noon on Saturdays, and if my car was not out by then, I would have to wait until Monday to retrieve it. It was 11:40. I looked at the driver. He looked at Julie. She nodded. He pulled forward. My car lurched as the wheel lift dragged it toward the street. I asked him where the tow yard was. He said Bonita Springs, which was a 20-minute drive. I asked Julie how I was supposed to get there. She said that was not her problem. I asked her if she was going to give me a ride. She laughed. She said, "You should have thought about that before you violated the parking rules." I asked her again what rule I had violated. She said it was all in the documentation. I asked her where the documentation was. She said it had been uploaded to the portal. I opened the portal again. Still nothing. She said it could take up to 72 hours to process. The truck pulled out of my driveway with my car attached. Julie followed it to the street, still filming. I followed her. The driver stopped at the curb and got out to adjust the chains. I asked him if he had ever towed a car from a driveway before. He said, "Yeah, all the time." I asked him if he checked the ownership before he hooked it up. He said the HOA gave him a list. I asked to see the list. He said it was on his tablet in the truck. Julie said, "Do not show him anything." The driver hesitated again. I could see he was uncomfortable. Julie stepped closer to him and said, "You are contracted with the HOA, not with individual residents." He nodded and climbed back into the truck. I stood in the street and watched my car roll away, rear wheels still off the ground, front wheels bumping over the uneven asphalt. Julie lowered her phone and said, "The tow yard will send you an invoice." I asked her if the invoice would include the $400 in fees. She said yes, plus storage. I asked her what the storage fee was. She said $50 per day. I asked her if that was legal. She said it was in the contract. I told her I never signed a contract with the tow company. She said the HOA signed it on behalf of all residents. I told her that was not how contracts worked. She said, "Take it up with the board." I asked her when the next board meeting was. She said 3 weeks. I told her I could not wait 3 weeks. She said, "You should have thought about that before you parked illegally." I called my neighbor, the one who had filmed the scene. His name was Marcus, and he was a real estate agent who had warned me what liens and disclosures would do when I first moved in. He picked up on the second ring. I told him what happened. He said he got the whole thing on video. I asked him if he could send it to me. He said he already posted it in the neighborhood group chat. I opened the chat. The video was there, along with about 30 comments. Half of them were people saying they had gotten similar notices. The other half were people defending Julie and saying the rules were the rules. One comment stood out. It was from a guy named Eric who said he had requested records from the HOA about the tow contract and had been told the records were exempt from disclosure. I screenshot the comment. I walked back to my house. My shift started in 6 hours. I needed to get my car back before then or I would miss work, which would trigger an attendance violation and put my job at risk. I called the tow yard. A woman answered. I told her my car had just been towed and I needed to pick it up. She asked for the ticket number. I did not have one. She said she could not release a vehicle without a ticket number. I asked her how I was supposed to get a ticket number. She said the tow company would send it. I asked her when. She said within 24 hours. I told her I needed my car today. She said I could pay the fees in person and they would release it. I asked her how much. She said it depended on the ticket. I told her I did not have a ticket. She said then she could not help me. I asked to speak to a manager. She said the manager was not available. I hung up and called Marcus back. He said he was already digging into the HOA vendor contracts. He had a friend who worked in county records and could pull corporate filings. I asked him what he was looking for. He said he wanted to see who owned the tow company and whether there were any financial ties to the HOA board. I asked him why that mattered. He said because if the board was getting kickbacks, the entire enforcement system was invalid. I told him that sounded like a long shot. He said he had seen it before in other communities. He said HOA boards were notorious for setting up shell companies and funneling money through vendor contracts. I asked him how long it would take. He said a few days. I told him I did not have a few days. He said, "Then you better hope the cop shows up and writes a report that contradicts Julie's story." The cop did show up about 40 minutes later. By then, my car was long gone. He took my statement and said it sounded like a civil dispute. I asked him if he could at least document that my car was legally parked. He walked over to my driveway and looked at the curb. He said there was no fire lane stripe. I told him that was what I had tried to tell Julie. He said he could note that in his report, but that it would not stop the tow. I asked him if he could call the tow yard and tell them to release my car. He said that was not his jurisdiction. I asked him what was his jurisdiction. He said criminal matters. I asked him if towing a car without proper notice was criminal. He said probably not. I asked him what it would take to make it criminal. He said fraud, theft, or extortion. I told him Julie had threatened additional fines if I interfered. He said that sounded like a civil matter. I asked the cop if he could at least write in his report that Julie had filmed me without explaining the violation. He said he could note that. I asked him if he could also note that she had refused to show me the tow authorization. He said he would include it. I thanked him. He handed me a case number and said I could request a copy of the report in a few days. I asked him if the report would help me get my car back. He said it might help if I went to court. I told him I could not wait for court. He said then you might want to just pay the fees. I told him the fees were $400 plus storage. He winced. He said, "Yeah, that is rough." Then he left. I called the HOA management company. A woman named Linda answered. I explained the situation. She said she would look into it. I asked her how long that would take. She said at least 2 business days. I told her I needed my car today. She said the board had the authority to authorize emergency tows, and if Julie had issued the authorization, there was nothing Linda could do without board approval. I asked her when the board met. She said the next meeting was in 3 weeks. I told her that was what Julie had said. Linda said, "Then that is accurate." I asked her if there was any way to get an emergency hearing. She said only if the board president agreed. I asked her who the board president was. She said his name was Gerald. I asked for his number. She said she could not give out board members' personal contact information. I asked her to call him on my behalf. She said she would leave him a message. I opened the neighborhood chat again. The comment thread under Marcus's video had exploded. Someone had posted a scanned copy of a notice they had received last week, claiming they had missed a hearing they were never told about. Another person posted a photo of a vendor truck parked in front of their house, claiming the HOA had sent someone to alter something on their property without permission under the excuse of safety. A third person posted a timeline showing that the HOA had reset cure deadlines 3 times in 2 months, making it impossible to ever be in compliance. I screenshot all of it. I started a new folder on my phone and labeled it Evidence. Julie posted in the chat. She said, "Anyone who interferes with HOA enforcement actions will be subject to fines and potential legal action." Several people responded asking her to clarify what constituted interference. She did not reply. Instead, she posted a second message. Reminder that all vehicles must display current resident decals, AND valid guest passes if parked in guest zones. Failure to comply will result in immediate towing. Someone asked her to define guest zone. She said any area not designated as resident-only parking. Someone else asked her to show them a map of resident-only parking. She said the map was available in the portal. Multiple people replied that there was no map in the portal. Julie said, "Check again." I checked. Still no map. I called the tow yard again. A different woman answered. I explained that my car had been towed this morning and I needed the ticket number. She put me on hold. After 5 minutes, she came back and said the ticket had not been entered into the system yet. I asked her when it would be entered. She said by end of business. I asked her what time that was. She said 5. I told her I needed my car before 5. She said I could come to the yard and pay in person, but I would have to wait until the ticket was entered. I asked her if I could pay now and wait there. She said the waiting area was closed due to staffing. I asked her if I could pay over the phone. She said no. I asked her why not. She said policy. I hung up. I called Marcus. He said his friend had pulled the corporate filing for the tow company. The company was registered to an LLC with a P.O. box address in Fort Myers. The LLC had 3 members listed. One of them was named Clark. I asked him if it was the same Clark. He said he did not know yet, but he was checking property records and business licenses. I told him to keep digging. He said he would. I asked him if he thought this was enough to take to the police. He said not yet. He said we needed to connect the LLC directly to Julie or another board member, and we needed to show a financial benefit. I asked him how we would do that. He said invoice records, bank statements, or emails. I asked him how we would get those. He said a records request. I drafted a records request. I asked for all contracts between the HOA and the tow company, all invoices paid to the tow company in the last 2 years, all correspondence between board members and the tow company, and all enforcement logs showing which vehicles had been towed and why. I submitted it through the portal. The portal said my request had been received and would be processed within 10 business days. I called Linda at the management company and told her I had submitted a records request and needed it expedited. She said she would let the board know. I asked her if Gerald had called her back. She said not yet. I asked her to try him again. She said she would. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Julie. She said, "Your records request has been received. Please note that vendor contracts are considered proprietary and are exempt from disclosure under Florida statutes." I replied asking which statute. She did not respond. I looked it up. The statute she was probably referring to covered trade secrets, but it had a carve-out for contracts involving public funds or fiduciary duties. I screenshot the statute and sent it to Marcus. He said that is going to be your wedge. I asked him what he meant. He said if we could prove the HOA was using homeowner dues to pay the tow company, the contract was not proprietary. I told him that seemed obvious. He said obvious and provable were two different things. I called Linda again. She sounded tired. I asked her if the HOA budget was public. She said yes. I asked her where I could find it. She said it was posted in the portal under financial documents. I opened the portal and navigated to financial documents. There was a budget summary from 2 years ago. Nothing more recent. I asked Linda why the current budget was not posted. She said the board had not approved it for release yet. I asked her when they would approve it. She said she did not know. I asked her if I could request a copy directly. She said I could submit a written request to the board. I told her I had already submitted a records request. She said that was different. I asked her how. She said the budget was a board document, not a vendor document. I told her that sounded like a distinction without a difference. She said, "I am just telling you the process." I drafted a second request, this time specifically for the HOA budget and all line items related to parking enforcement, towing, and vendor payments. I submitted it through the portal. I also sent a copy directly to Linda via email and asked her to confirm receipt. She replied within 10 minutes saying she had forwarded it to Gerald. I asked her if Gerald had responded to her earlier message. She said no. I asked her if that was normal. She said Gerald was often slow to respond. I asked her if there was anyone else on the board I could contact. She said the vice president. I told her the vice president was Julie. She said, "Oh, right." Then she said the board secretary might be able to help. I asked for the secretary's name. She said it was Dawn. I asked for Dawn's contact information. Linda said she would ask Dawn to reach out to me. Dawn called me 20 minutes later. She sounded nervous. I explained the situation. She said she had seen the video in the group chat. I asked her if she thought the tow was legitimate. She hesitated. Then she said, "I think Julie is very committed to enforcement." I asked her if that was a yes or a no. She said she did not want to get involved. I told her I was not asking her to get involved. I was asking her if the tow was legitimate. She said she did not know. I asked her if she had access to the vendor contract. She said only Gerald had access to vendor contracts. I asked her why. She said that was how the board had always operated. I asked her if that was legal. She said she assumed so. I asked her if she had ever questioned it. She said no. I thanked her and hung up. I checked the time. It was almost 3. My shift started at 6. I called the tow yard one more time. The first woman answered again. I asked if the ticket had been entered yet. She said no. I asked her why not. She said the driver had not returned with the paperwork. I asked her when he would return. She said she did not know. I asked her if I could speak to the owner. She said the owner was not available. I asked her when the owner would be available. She said Monday. I told her that was unacceptable. She said, I am sorry, sir, that is all I can tell you. I asked her if she understood that I needed my car for work. She said a lot of people need their cars for work. Then she hung up. I sat on my porch and opened the neighborhood chat. Marcus had posted a follow-up. He said his friend had confirmed that the LLC owner on the tow company filing matched Julie's married name. Someone replied asking if that meant Julie owned the tow company. Marcus said not necessarily, but it meant she was likely a member of the ownership group. Another person posted a link to a state database showing business licenses. The tow company had been issued a license 3 months after Julie was elected vice president. Someone else posted a timeline showing a spike in towing incidents starting around the same time. I downloaded all of it and added it to my evidence folder. Julie posted again. She said, spreading false information about HOA board members is defamation and will be pursued legally. Marcus replied asking what was false. Julie did not respond. Instead, Gerald posted, he said the board takes all allegations seriously and will investigate any claims of impropriety. In the meantime, residents are reminded to follow all parking regulations to avoid enforcement actions. Someone replied asking Gerald if he had reviewed the vendor contract. Gerald did not respond. Someone else asked if the board had ever voted on the tow contract. Gerald said, all vendor contracts are approved by the board in accordance with HOA bylaws. Marcus replied asking for the meeting minutes that showed the vote. Gerald said, minutes are available to members upon request. Marcus said, I requested them 2 weeks ago and have not received them. Gerald did not respond. I walked to the gatehouse. It was a small structure at the entrance to the neighborhood with a mechanical arm that lifted when you scanned your resident card. Julie was standing inside the gatehouse talking to the attendant. I walked up to the window. Julie saw me and stepped outside. She said, you are not allowed in the gatehouse. I told her I was not in the gatehouse. I was outside the gatehouse. She said, the gatehouse area is restricted to authorized personnel. I asked her who authorized her. She said the board. I asked her if the board had voted on it. She said that was none of my business. I told her everything the board did was my business because I paid dues. She said dues do not give you the right to harass board members. I asked her about the LLC. Her face went still. She said, what LLC? I told her the one that owned the tow company. She said, I do not know what you are talking about. I told her Marcus had pulled the corporate filings and her name was on them. She said, that is private information and you have no right to access it. I told her corporate filings were public records. She said, you are harassing me. I told her I was asking a question. She said, this conversation is over. She turned and walked back into the gatehouse. I stayed at the window. The attendant looked uncomfortable. I asked him if he knew anything about the tow contract. He said he just worked the gate. I asked him if he had ever seen Julie give the tow company a list of vehicles. He said he did not want to get involved. I thanked him and walked away. My certified mail arrived late. I had sent a formal dispute letter to the HOA 3 days ago via certified mail, but it had been delayed in transit. When it finally arrived, Julie posted in the group chat that I had chosen not to file a timely dispute and therefore waived my right to contest the tow. Someone replied, pointing out that certified mail delays were not the sender's fault. Julie said, "The rules require disputes to be filed within 48 hours of the incident, and the postmark shows this was sent after the deadline." Marcus replied with a photo of my receipt showing the mail had been sent within 24 hours. Julie said the HOA goes by receipt date, not postmark. Someone asked her to show them the rule. She said it was in the bylaws. Multiple people replied that they had read the bylaws and there was no such rule. Julie said, "Check the amended bylaws." Someone asked when the bylaws were amended. Julie said, "Last month." Someone asked why no one had been notified. Julie did not respond. I pulled up the portal and searched for amended bylaws. Nothing. I called Linda. She said she was not aware of any amendments. I asked her if the board could amend bylaws without notifying residents. She said no. Amendments required a member vote. I asked her if there had been a member vote in the last month. She said no. I asked her if Gerald or Julie had mentioned anything about amendments. She said no. I asked her to check with Gerald. She said she would. I hung up and posted in the group chat that Linda had confirmed there were no amended bylaws. Julie replied, "Linda is not authorized to speak on behalf of the board." Gerald posted, "The board will issue a clarification shortly." No clarification was issued. I called Marcus. He said his friend had pulled bank records for the LLC using a subpoena from an unrelated lawsuit. The records showed monthly payments from the HOA to the LLC that matched the dates of bulk towing incidents. He said it was not definitive proof of kickbacks, but it was enough to raise serious questions. I asked him if we could take it to the police. He said maybe, but we would need more. I asked him what more. He said evidence of intent. I asked him what that looked like. He said emails, texts, recorded conversations. I told him Julie had been filming everything. He said that works both ways. I asked him what he meant. He said if Julie had been dumb enough to say something incriminating on camera, we could use it. I told him I had video of the tow. He said, "Send it to me." If you are enjoying this wild HOA nightmare, smash that like button and subscribe for more stories where the rules get flipped and the Karens face consequences. I spent the next 2 hours reviewing every video, screenshot, and document I had collected. I built a timeline. I cross-referenced the towing dates with the bank payments Marcus had found. I matched Julie's enforcement posts in the group chat with the dates of vendor activity. I found a pattern. Every time Julie posted a new parking rule clarification, a wave of towing incidents followed within 72 hours. Every time a towing incident occurred, a payment from the HOA to the LLC followed within a week. I printed the timeline and highlighted the connections. I labeled it with sticky tabs. I took a photo and sent it to Marcus. He replied, "This is your smoking gun." My neighbor knocked on my door. It was a woman named Angela who lived 2 houses down. She said she had received a notice this morning claiming she missed a hearing about her fence height. I asked her when the hearing was. She said last Tuesday. I asked her if she had been notified. She said no. I asked her if she had checked the portal. She said yes, there was nothing. I asked her what the notice said. She showed me. It was identical to the format Julie had used on me, except it referenced a fence rule instead of a parking rule. I asked Angela if she had ever had a problem with her fence before. She said no. I asked her when she installed the fence. She said 3 years ago, and it had been approved by the previous board. I told her to keep the notice and take photos of everything. She asked me why. I told her I thought the board was running a scam. Angela asked me what kind of scam. I explained the LLC connection and the payment pattern. She said, "So Julie is fining people and then paying herself through the tow company." I said that was what it looked like. She asked me if I had proof. I said I was working on it. She asked me what she should do. I told her to file a dispute and request a hearing and to make sure she documented everything. She said, "What if they ignore me?" I said, "Then we go to the state." She asked me what that meant. I told her Florida had an HOA ombudsman and a dispute resolution process. She said, "How do you know that?" I told her I had spent the last 4 hours researching HOA law. She said, "You are way more patient than I would be." I told her I was not patient, I was angry, and anger was a great motivator. Gerald finally called me. He said he had reviewed my records request and wanted to discuss it. I asked him what there was to discuss. He said some of the records I requested were confidential. I asked him which ones. He said the vendor contracts and the invoice records. I told him those were exactly the records I needed to verify that the tow was legitimate. He said the tow was legitimate, and I did not need to see the contracts to know that. I told him I had a right to see any contract paid for with my dues. He said the contracts contained proprietary information. I asked him what proprietary information. He said pricing structures and service terms. I told him I did not care about pricing structures. I cared about whether the contract authorized Julie to tow my car from my own driveway. He said Julie had the authority under her role as vice president. I asked him to show me where in the bylaws it said that. He said it was implied. I told him implied authority was not the same as actual authority. He said, "I am not going to argue with you." I told him I was not arguing. I was asking for records I was legally entitled to. He said, "We will provide what we are required to provide." Then he hung up. I called Linda and asked her if she had heard from Gerald. She said yes, he had told her to deny my records request. I asked her on what grounds. She said proprietary information. I told her that was not a valid grounds under Florida law. She said, "I am just following instructions." I asked her if she agreed with the instructions. She said it did not matter whether she agreed. I told her it mattered to me. She sighed. She said, off the record, "I think you are right, but I do not have the authority to override the board." I asked her what would happen if she released the records anyway. She said she would be fired. I told her I understood. She said, "I am sorry, I cannot help you more." I thanked her and hung up. I filed a complaint with the Florida Department of Business and Professional Regulation, which oversees HOA disputes. The online form asked for a detailed description of the issue, copies of all relevant documents, and a statement of what I was seeking as a remedy. I attached the timeline, the videos, the notice, the police report case number, and the screenshots from the group chat. I wrote that I was seeking an order requiring the HOA to release the vendor contract, refund the tow fees, and investigate potential self-dealing by board members. The form said my complaint would be reviewed within 30 days. I screenshot the confirmation and posted it in the group chat. Julie replied, "Filing frivolous complaints is harassment." I replied, "Filing legitimate complaints is a homeowner right." She did not respond. The next board meeting was not for another 3 weeks, but Marcus found a loophole. The bylaws allowed any member to call a special meeting if they collected signatures from 20% of the homeowners. Marcus and I spent 2 days going door to door. We explained the situation, showed people the timeline, and asked them to sign. Most people signed. A few people said they did not want to get involved. One person said Julie had helped her with a landscaping issue, and she did not believe Julie would do anything wrong. I thanked her and moved on. By the end of the second day, we had signatures from 30% of the homeowners. I submitted the petition through the portal and sent a copy to Linda. She called me the next morning and said the board had scheduled a special meeting for the following Saturday at 10. Julie posted in the group chat that the special meeting was a waste of time and resources and that the board would not be intimidated by frivolous complaints. Gerald posted that the meeting would proceed in accordance with the bylaws and that all members were welcome to attend. Someone asked if the meeting would be recorded. Gerald said yes. Someone else asked if the recording would be posted. Gerald said it would be available upon request. Marcus replied, "I will be recording it myself and posting it in the chat." Julie replied, "Unauthorized recording is prohibited." Marcus replied, "Actually, Florida is a two-party consent state, but HOA meetings are considered public forums under the bylaws, so consent is not required." Julie did not respond. The morning of the meeting, I woke up early and reviewed my notes. I had printed copies of the timeline, the bank records Marcus had obtained, the screenshots from the group chat, and the notices Angela and I had received. I put everything in a folder with labeled tabs. I also printed a copy of the Florida statute governing HOA fiduciary duties and highlighted the section about self-dealing. I walked to the meeting location, which was a small outdoor area behind the clubhouse with folding chairs and a folding table. About 40 people were already there. Marcus waved me over. He said, "I got the corporate records for the LLC. Julie is listed as a managing member." I asked him if he had proof. He showed me his phone. There it was, a state database entry showing Julie Clark as a managing member of the LLC that owned the tow company. I took a screenshot. Gerald called the meeting to order. Julie sat beside him with her clipboard in a clear plastic sleeve. Dawn, the secretary, sat on the other side taking notes. Gerald said, "This special meeting has been called to address concerns raised by several homeowners regarding parking enforcement and vendor contracts. I request that we proceed in an orderly fashion and that everyone has an opportunity to speak." I raised my hand. Gerald nodded at me. I stood up and walked to the front. I placed my folder on the table and opened it to the first tab. I said, "I am here to present evidence that the HOA vice president has been using her position to funnel money to a company she owns, and that the parking enforcement actions she has taken are part of a scheme to generate revenue for that company." Julie stood up. She said, "That is defamation, and I will not sit here and listen to it." I said, "It is not defamation if it is true." She said, "You have no proof." I said, "Actually, I do." I pulled out the timeline and slid it across the table so everyone could see it. I pointed to the highlighted sections. I said, "This timeline shows that every time you post a new parking rule in the group chat, a wave of towing incidents follows within 72 hours. It also shows that every time a towing incident occurs, a payment from the HOA to the tow company LLC follows within a week." I pulled out the corporate records Marcus had found and placed them on the table. I said, "This document shows that you, Julie Clark, are listed as a managing member of that LLC." The room went silent. Julie's face turned red. She said, "That is private information and you had no right to access it." I said, "Corporate records are public information and I have every right to access them." She said, "Even if I am a member of the LLC, that does not prove anything." I said, "It proves you have a financial interest in the tow company, which means every tow you authorize puts money in your pocket. That is called self-dealing, and it is illegal under Florida law." I pulled out the statute and placed it on the table. I said, "This statute requires board members to disclose any financial interest in vendor contracts and to recuse themselves from decisions involving those vendors. Did you disclose your interest? Julie did not answer. Gerald said, Julie, did you disclose? Julie said, I do not have to answer that. Gerald said, actually, you do. Marcus stood up. He said, I have more. He pulled out his phone and held it up. He said, I have video of Julie authorizing a tow on false grounds. She claimed the narrator's car was blocking a fire lane, but there was no fire lane. She also claimed his decal was expired, but the decal was valid. She also claimed he missed a hearing, but there was no hearing scheduled. Every one of those claims was false, and she made them on camera. He played the video on his phone and held it up so the room could see. It was the video of Julie at my driveway, pointing at my car and saying, "This is not parking, it is a violation." The room erupted. People started shouting questions at Julie. She tried to speak, but no one could hear her over the noise. Gerald banged his hand on the table and said, "Order." Everyone quiet down. Gerald looked at Julie. He said, "Julie, is it true that you are a managing member of the tow company LLC?" Julie said, "That is none of your business." Gerald said, "It is absolutely my business. I am the board president." She said, "Fine, yes, I am a member, but that does not mean I did anything wrong." I said, "You just admitted to self-dealing in front of 40 witnesses." Julie said, "I did not deal anything. I enforced the rules." I said, "You enforced rules that do not exist in order to generate towing incidents that benefit a company you own. That is fraud." Julie said, "You do not know what you are talking about." I said, "Then explain the payments. Explain why the HOA has paid your company over $30,000 in the last year. Explain why every single one of those payments happened right after you issued a parking violation." Julie opened her mouth and then closed it. She looked at Gerald. Gerald said, "Julie, I think you need to resign." Julie said, "I am not resigning." Gerald said, "If you do not resign, I will call a vote to remove you." Julie said, "You do not have the authority." Gerald said, "The bylaws give the board the authority to remove any member for misconduct. I am calling the vote now. Dawn, please record this." Dawn nodded and started writing. Gerald said, "All in favor of removing Julie Clark from the board for self-dealing and misconduct, raise your hand." Every hand in the room went up except Julie's. Gerald said, "The motion passes. Julie, you are removed from the board effective immediately." Julie stood up and said, "This is illegal and I will sue." Gerald said, "You can do whatever you want, but you are no longer a board member and you are no longer authorized to make enforcement decisions." Julie walked out. The room stayed silent for a moment. Then someone started clapping. Then everyone started clapping. Marcus walked over and shook my hand. He said, "You did it." I said, "We did it." Angela came over and hugged me. She said, "Thank you." I told her we still had work to do. Gerald stood up and said, "I want to apologize to everyone here. I was not aware of Julie's conflict of interest, and I take responsibility for not conducting proper oversight. Moving forward, we will be reviewing all vendor contracts and implementing a disclosure policy for board members. We will also be issuing refunds to anyone who was towed under Julie's enforcement actions. If you believe you are owed a refund, please submit a request to Linda at the management company." I asked Gerald if the HOA would be terminating the contract with the tow company. He said yes. I asked him if the HOA would be pursuing legal action against Julie. He said the board would be consulting with an attorney and would take appropriate action based on the attorney's advice. I asked him if he would release the vendor contracts and invoice records I had requested. He said yes, and he apologized for the delay. I thanked him. Marcus asked if the board would be revising the parking rules to prevent future abuse. Gerald said yes, and that the board would hold a separate meeting to solicit input from homeowners on what the rules should look like. Someone in the crowd shouted, "No more towing without notice." Gerald said, "Agreed." The meeting ended. People stood around talking. A few people came up to me and thanked me. One guy said he had been towed 6 months ago and had always suspected it was a scam, but did not have proof. He asked if he could get a refund. I told him to submit a request to Linda. Another woman said Julie had threatened to fine her for a mailbox that was supposedly the wrong color, but the rule book said nothing about mailbox colors. She asked if she should file a complaint. I told her to bring it up at the next meeting. Marcus and I walked back to my house. He said, "You know Julie is going to come after you." I said, "Let her. I have everything documented." He said, "She might try to sue you for defamation." I said, "Truth is an absolute defense." He said, "I know, but lawsuits are expensive even if you win." I said, "Then I will countersue for malicious prosecution." 2 days later, Linda called me. She said my car had been released from the tow yard and the fees had been waived. She also said the HOA would be refunding the $400 Julie had charged me, plus an additional $200 for my inconvenience. I asked her when I would receive the refund. She said within 2 weeks. I asked her if the board had decided to pursue legal action against Julie. She said the board had voted to refer the matter to the state attorney for investigation. I asked her what that meant. She said it meant the state would decide whether to file criminal charges. I thanked her. She said, "I am sorry this happened to you." I told her it was not her fault. She said, "Still, I should have pushed back harder when Julie started making up rules." I told her she was in a tough position. She said, "I was, but that is not an excuse." I posted an update in the neighborhood chat. I said the board had voted to remove Julie, terminate the tow contract, and issue refunds to anyone who had been wrongly towed. I also said the state attorney was investigating Julie for fraud and self-dealing. The responses were immediate. People thanked me. People said they were glad someone finally stood up to Julie. A few people said they had known something was off but were afraid to speak up. One person said, "Julie is already gone. Her house went up for sale this morning." I checked the real estate listings. Sure enough, Julie's house was listed. Marcus texted me, "She is running." I replied, "Let her run. The state knows where to find her." The gatehouse incident happened the next week. I was coming home from my shift at 6 in the morning. The gate was glitching, opening and closing randomly. I swiped my card and waited. The gate opened halfway and then stopped. I waited. It did not move. I honked. The attendant came out and said the system was down. I asked him how long it would be. He said he did not know. I told him I needed to get home. He said he could manually open the gate, but I would have to wait while he called maintenance. I said fine. He went back into the gatehouse. I sat in my car. 5 minutes later, a bright yellow tow truck pulled up behind me, blocking the lane. I looked in my mirror. The driver got out. It was the same guy who had hooked up my car weeks ago. I got out of my car. The driver said, "You are blocking the gate." I told him the gate was broken. He said, "Then you need to move." I told him I could not move because the gate was in the way. He said, "That is not my problem." I asked him why he was here. He said he got a call about a vehicle obstructing the entrance. I asked him who called. He did not answer. Then I saw her. Julie was standing behind the tow truck with her phone on a gimbal, filming. I said, "You have got to be kidding me." She said, "You are trespassing." I told her I lived here. She said, "The gate system shows no valid entry, which means you are trespassing." I told her the gate was broken. She said, "That is an excuse, not a valid entry." The attendant came out of the gatehouse and said maintenance was on the way. Julie walked up to him and said, "This vehicle needs to be towed immediately." The attendant said, "He lives here. His card is in the system." Julie said, "The system is offline, so his card is not valid." The attendant said, "That does not make sense." Julie said, "Are you questioning my authority?" The attendant said, "You do not have authority anymore. You were removed from the board." Julie said that removal was illegal, and I am contesting it. The attendant said, "I got an email from Gerald saying you are not allowed on HOA property." Julie said, "Gerald does not speak for the residents." The attendant said, "He is the board president, so yes, he does." Julie turned to the tow truck driver and said, "Hook it up." The driver hesitated. I said, "If you touch my car, I am calling the police." He said, "I am just doing my job." I said, "Your job is to tow vehicles that are illegally parked, not vehicles that are stuck at a broken gate." He looked at Julie. She said, "The vehicle is obstructing access." I said, "The vehicle is waiting for the gate to open." Julie said, "The gate is open." I pointed at the gate arm, which was still halfway down. I said, "Does that look open to you?" She said, "It is open enough." I said, "Open enough is not open." She said, "You are being obstinate." I said, "You are being insane." More cars started lining up behind the tow truck. People honked. The driver looked around nervously. Julie started shouting at the other drivers, telling them to back up. No one moved. One driver got out and said, "What is going on?" The attendant said, "The gate is broken and this lady is trying to get someone towed for waiting." The driver said, "That is ridiculous." Julie said, "This is none of your business." The driver said, "I live here, so it is my business." Julie pointed her phone at him. He said, "Are you filming me?" She said, "I am documenting obstruction." He said, "You are documenting yourself acting like a lunatic." Another driver got out. Then another. Within 2 minutes, there were 6 people standing in the lane, all of them telling Julie to leave. Marcus pulled up on foot. He was filming with his phone. He said, "I saw the group chat blow up. What is happening?" I told him Julie was trying to get me towed again. He said, "She does not have the authority to do that anymore." I said, "Try telling her that." Julie turned to Marcus and said, "You are harassing me." Marcus said, "I am standing on a public road filming a public incident." She said, "This is private property." Marcus said, "This is an HOA road, which is semi-public under Florida law." She said, "You are twisting the law." He said, "No, I am reading the law." She started walking toward him. He backed up. She followed. He said, "You are now on camera following me while I am retreating, which could be considered menacing." She stopped. Then she screamed. Just screamed, no words. Everyone stopped and stared at her. The tow truck driver got back in his truck and left. He did not say anything, he just drove away. Julie watched him go. Then she turned to me and said, "This is not over." I said, "Yes, it is." She said, "I will make sure you regret this." I said, "You already tried that and it did not work." She said, "You think you won, but you did not." The board acted without a quorum, which means the vote was invalid. I asked her what she meant. She said, "Dawn was not present for the vote." I said, "Dawn was sitting right there, taking notes." Julie said, "Dawn was not listed on the official roster for the meeting, which means she was not a valid board member at the time of the vote." Marcus said, "That is insane." Julie said, "That is the rule." Marcus pulled out his phone and called Gerald. He put it on speaker. Gerald answered. Marcus said, Julie is claiming the vote to remove her was invalid because Dawn was not on the official roster. Gerald said, that is not true. Dawn was on the roster. Julie said, prove it. Gerald said, I have the roster right here. I am looking at it. Julie said, then send it to me. Gerald said, I will post it in the portal. Julie said, the portal is not an official record. Gerald said, the portal is the official record according to the bylaws. Julie said, I am challenging the bylaws. Gerald said, you do not have the authority to challenge the bylaws. You are not on the board anymore. Julie said, the removal was invalid. Gerald said, Julie, if you do not leave the property right now, I am going to call the police and have you arrested for trespassing. Julie said, you would not dare. Gerald said, try me. 2 police cars pulled up. One of the officers got out and walked over. He said, we got a call about a disturbance. Gerald was still on the phone. Marcus held it up and said, this is Gerald. He is the HOA president. He called you. The officer took the phone. Gerald explained the situation. The officer handed the phone back to Marcus and walked over to Julie. He said, ma'am, I need you to leave the property. Julie said, I live here. The officer said, do you? Julie said, I did, but I am in the process of selling my house. The officer said, so you do not live here anymore? Julie said, I still own the house. The officer said, that does not give you the right to block the entrance and harass residents. Julie said, I am not harassing anyone. I am enforcing the rules. The officer said, you are not authorized to enforce the rules. Julie said, says who? The officer said, says the HOA president and about 20 witnesses. Julie opened her mouth and then closed it. The officer said, I am going to ask you one more time to leave. If you do not leave, I will arrest you for trespassing. Julie looked around. Everyone was watching her. She turned and walked to her car. She got in and sat there for a minute. Then she started the engine and drove away. The officer walked over to me and asked if I was okay. I said yes. He asked if I wanted to file a report. I said yes. He took my statement and gave me a case number. He said, this is the second time I have been out here for an HOA issue involving this woman. I told him it would probably be the last. He said, let us hope so. He got back in his car and left. The attendant finally got the gate open. I drove through. Marcus followed me to my house. He said, that was wild. I said, that was closure. He said, you think she is done. I said, I think she is out of moves. Marcus was right. The neighborhood group chat exploded that morning. Someone had filmed the entire gatehouse incident and posted it. The video showed Julie screaming, following Marcus and refusing to leave when the police told her to. It showed her claiming the board vote was invalid and threatening me. It showed the tow truck driver leaving without hooking up my car. Within an hour, the video had been shared in 3 other neighborhood groups. Someone posted a compilation of all of Julie's previous incidents, including the driveway tow, the fake hearing notices, and the rule clarifications she had made up. The compilation was labeled Julie Clark HOA Tyrant Meltdown. It got 200 views in the first hour. By noon, Gerald had posted an official statement in the portal. He said the board had reviewed the meeting minutes and confirmed that the vote to remove Julie was valid. He also said the board had consulted with an attorney and determined that the board votes happened without a quorum, so the entire enforcement wave is invalid. He said the HOA would be issuing refunds to everyone who had been fined or towed under Julie's enforcement actions. He also said the HOA was terminating all contracts with vendors connected to Julie's LLC. He said the HOA would be implementing new policies to prevent conflicts of interest in the future. He said Julie's resignation was effective immediately and that she was banned from attending HOA meetings or participating in HOA business. He said anyone who had been harmed by Julie's actions should contact the management company to discuss remedies. Linda called me that afternoon. She said the state attorney had opened an investigation into Julie's conduct. She said the investigation would take several months, but that the preliminary findings suggested Julie had violated multiple statutes related to fiduciary duty and fraud. She said the HOA would be cooperating fully with the investigation. She also said Gerald had asked her to personally apologize to me on behalf of the board. I told her I appreciated that. She said, "I know this has been incredibly stressful for you, and I want you to know that we are committed to making sure nothing like this happens again." I told her I believed her. She said, "If you need anything, please do not hesitate to call." I thanked her and hung up. Angela came over that evening. She said she had received her refund from the HOA, along with a formal apology letter. She said the letter acknowledged that the fence violation notice she had received was invalid and that the HOA had no authority to fine her for a fence that had been approved by the previous board. She said she was relieved. I told her I was glad it worked out. She said, "This would not have happened without you." I told her it would not have happened without Marcus and everyone else who signed the petition and showed up to the meeting. She said, "Still, you were the one who put it all together." I told her I just did what needed to be done. She hugged me and said, "Thank you." A few days later, Julie's group post got removed and replaced with a correction. The correction stated that the parking enforcement actions Julie had taken were not authorized by the board and did not reflect HOA policy. It stated that the HOA had issued refunds to all affected residents and had implemented new oversight procedures to prevent similar abuses in the future. It also stated that Julie Clark was no longer affiliated with the HOA in any capacity. The post was pinned to the top of the group chat. Someone commented, "About time." Another person commented, "Justice served." Marcus commented, "Never mess with someone who keeps receipts." The HOA held a follow-up meeting 2 weeks later to revise the parking rules. About 50 people showed up. Gerald opened the meeting by thanking everyone for their patience and reiterating the board's commitment to transparency and fairness. He said the board had drafted a new parking policy and wanted feedback before voting on it. He handed out copies. The new policy eliminated all subjective enforcement provisions. It specified that resident decals were valid for 2 years and did not need to be pristine. It specified that guest passes were valid for 72 hours and could be used by anyone the resident authorized. It specified that towing could only occur after written notice and a 48-hour cure period, except in cases of genuine emergency. It specified that all tow authorizations had to be approved by the board president and documented in writing. It specified that all vendor contracts had to be disclosed to homeowners and could not involve board members or their immediate family. Someone asked if the new policy would prevent another Julie situation. Gerald said that is the goal. Someone else asked what would happen if a board member violated the conflict of interest rule. Gerald said immediate removal and referral to the state attorney. Someone asked if the board would consider term limits to prevent any one person from accumulating too much power. Gerald said, "That is a good idea, and we will put it to a vote at the annual meeting." The room applauded. Marcus raised his hand and said, "I move to adopt the new parking policy as written." Someone seconded. Gerald called for a vote. Every hand went up. The policy passed unanimously. I got a call from the state attorney's office a month later. The investigator said they had completed their review of Julie's conduct and had decided to file charges. The charges included fraud, self-dealing, and official misconduct. The investigator said Julie had been arrested and released on bond. He said the trial was scheduled for 6 months out. He asked if I would be willing to testify. I said yes. He thanked me and said someone from the prosecutor's office would be in touch. I asked him what the likely outcome was. He said, based on the evidence, I would say she is looking at probation and restitution at a minimum, possibly jail time, depending on how the judge views the severity. I thanked him and hung up. Marcus and I met for coffee the next day. He said, "You did it." I said, "We did it." He said, "No, you were the one who refused to back down." I told him I could not have done it without his help. He said, "I just pulled some records. You built the case." I told him the case built itself once we started looking. He said, "That is the thing about people like Julie. They always think they are smarter than everyone else, and that makes them sloppy." I said, "She got sloppy because she thought no one would challenge her." He said, "And that was her biggest mistake." A few months later, Julie pleaded guilty to 2 counts of fraud and 1 count of self-dealing. She was sentenced to 2 years probation, ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA and all affected homeowners, and banned from serving on any HOA board in Florida for 10 years. The restitution amount was over $40,000. The HOA used the money to fund a reserve account for legal expenses and to hire an independent auditor to review all vendor contracts. Gerald sent an email to all homeowners summarizing the outcome and thanking everyone who had participated in the process. He said, "This was a difficult chapter for our community, but I believe we came out stronger because we stood together and demanded accountability." I ran into the tow truck driver a few weeks after that. He was working for a different company. He saw me and walked over. He said, "Hey, I just wanted to say I am sorry about what happened. I did not know the whole situation. I told him it was not his fault." He said, "I should have asked more questions." I told him he was just doing his job. He said, "Yeah, but my job should not have involved helping someone scam people." I told him he did the right thing by leaving when things got crazy at the gatehouse. He said, "I quit that company right after that." I could not work for someone who was part of something like that. I told him I respected that. He said, "Thanks, man." Then he left. Life in the neighborhood went back to normal. The new parking policy worked. No one got towed. No one got fined for made-up violations. The gate stopped glitching after maintenance replaced the control box. The group chat became boring again, full of posts about garage sales and lost pets instead of enforcement drama. Angela started a neighborhood watch group that actually focused on safety instead of rule enforcement. Marcus ran for the board and won. Gerald stayed on as president. Dawn stayed on as secretary. The 3 of them ran the HOA like a normal HOA, handling maintenance and organizing events and staying out of people's lives. I kept working my shifts. I kept parking in my driveway. I kept my resident decal on my windshield even though it faded a little more each month. No one cared. The HOA issued a memo clarifying the rule Karen weaponized, specifying that decals were valid as long as the serial number was legible, and that no one would be fined for normal wear and tear. I framed a copy of that memo and hung it in my garage. Marcus saw it one day and laughed. He said, "You are never going to let that go, are you?" I said, "Never." I saw Julie one more time. She was at the grocery store. She saw me and turned around and walked the other way. I did not follow her. I did not say anything. I just kept shopping. Marcus texted me later and said, "I heard Julie left town." I asked him where she went. He said he did not know and did not care. I said, "Good riddance." He said, "Amen to that." The neighborhood threw a block party that summer. Someone set up a grill. Someone else brought a cooler full of drinks. Kids ran around with water balloons. People sat in lawn chairs and talked. Gerald gave a short speech thanking everyone for their patience during the transition and saying he was proud of how the community had come together. He said, "We proved that when people stand up for what is right, accountability wins." Everyone clapped. Marcus nudged me and said, "He is talking about you." I said, "He is talking about all of us." Marcus said, "Take the compliment." I smiled. Angela walked over with a plate of food. She said, "I made too much. Want some?" I took a plate. She said, "I still think about what could have happened if you had not pushed back." I told her someone else would have eventually. She said, "Maybe, but you were the one who actually did it." I told her I was just tired of being pushed around. She said, "That is what makes you different. Most people get tired and give up." I told her I almost gave up a few times. She said, "But you did not." I said, "No, I did not." Marcus walked over and said, "I got the final invoice records from Linda. Turns out Julie made over $60,000 from the tow scheme over 2 years." I said, "That is insane." He said, "That is criminal." I asked him if the state attorney had included that in the restitution calculation. He said yes. I asked him if Julie had paid yet. He said she had made the first payment. I asked him how many payments she had left. He said 18. I said good. He said I walked away on purpose because I wanted her to follow and say more. I looked at him. He grinned. He said, "That was your play all along, was not it." I said, "I wanted her on the record." He said, "You got her on the record, on video, and in front of witnesses." I said, "That was the point." Gerald came over and said, "I just wanted to thank you again." I told him he did not need to keep thanking me. He said, "Yes, I do, because you saved this HOA from becoming a disaster." I told him the HOA was already a disaster. I just helped clean it up. He said, "You did more than that. You showed everyone that the rules apply to the board too." I told him that should be obvious. He said, "It should be, but it is not always." He shook my hand and walked away. The sun started to set. People started packing up. Kids were still running around. Someone turned on music. Marcus and I sat on the curb and watched the street. He said, "You ever think about moving?" I said, "Not anymore." He said, "Good, because we need people like you here." I said, "People like me." He said, "People who do not put up with nonsense." I told him there were plenty of people like that. He said, "Not as many as you would think." I said, "Then maybe we should work on that." He said, "That is what the neighborhood watch is for." I said, "True." The party ended around 9. I walked home. My driveway was empty and quiet. My car was parked exactly where it should be. My resident decal was still faded but legible. My guest pass was sitting on the dashboard even though I did not have any guests. I left it there anyway. It felt like a small victory. I went inside and sat on my couch. My phone buzzed. It was a message from the neighborhood chat. Someone had posted a photo from the block party with the caption, "Best neighborhood ever." Someone else replied, "Agreed." Marcus replied, "Thanks to everyone who stood up when it mattered." Angela replied, "Amen." I liked the post and put my phone down. I thought about everything that had happened. The tow, the confrontation, the evidence, the meeting, the vote, the charges, the restitution, the new rules. It had been exhausting and stressful and infuriating, but it had also been worth it. Because now the neighborhood was better. Now people did not have to worry about getting towed from their own driveways. Now the rules made sense. Now the board was accountable. Now Julie was gone. I leaned back and closed my eyes. For the first time in months, I felt like I could relax. I appreciate you coming back.